Chicago. I will show you around, and that's what we're here to do right now is to for me to show you around. I'm going to first of all, I want to tell you that there's 165 pictures. Uh, and you'll down in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the number. If we were meeting in person, that would be important in case you got a train to catch or something. Why do I have to wait for a few more or something? I also just want to tell you how this is going to work. I'm going to describe surface transit, rapid transit, suburban railroads, interurbans, and then wind it up with a few pictures of museums that have Chicago area equipment, museums in the Chicago area. So unfortunately, no seashore or them. If the program will be broken down into early development and then 1920s through the 50s and then current developments. And yes, there will be an intermission. So let's have at it. First of all, where is Chicago? I'm going to do something here. There. Okay, it was distracting. So where is Chicago? It's on the opposite end of the Chicago, New York electric air line had it been built all the way out here in the Midwest. What's important about the layout here is that it's at the south end of Lake Michigan, where way back when this was the center of commerce coming this way, and all the railroads had to come around the south end of the lake, and it just became a natural place for a city to happen. So we'll get on with it. Public transportation in Chicago started in the 1830s, not with urban transportation, but with, I guess you could call it interurban transportation. In the 1830s, Chicago was still small enough that you could walk everywhere. There wasn't a lot of need for public transit. Somebody built a tavern about a half a mile from Fort Dearborn, and that was considered, I think, to be urban sprawl at the time. But what was necessary was transportation out to the hinterlands, particularly out to Galena in the northwest corner of the state of Illinois, which was the center of the lead manufacturing or lead mining territory. So stagecoach operations began in 1834, but it was a pretty easy adaptation to, well, let's use the same style of vehicle. And when the time came in the 1840s to adapt the stagecoaches for horse-drawn omnibuses. Now, this was a picture from years ago, a little bit of a lampoon on the enthusiastic ridership on the state the omnibuses. So the next thing that was important in the 1840s, now this says Chicago and Northwestern Railway System, my first and second full-time employer, but in 1848, the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad opened west from Chicago. The first railroad in Chicago didn't connect with the east, it went west. The point of it being to connect with the city of Galena so that you could haul the lead in. Hauling lead in wagons over muddy roads didn't do very well. So the GNCU opened to the west, and then shortly after that, a whole bunch of other railroads opened. This is a picture from a map from 1873, but what I'm going to focus on here is what happened in the mid 1850s. That in the mid 1850s, the original GNCU went straight west. I'm hopeful that everybody can see the cursor here going west. The GNCU was acquired by the Chicago and Northwestern that ran a route going straight north and a one going straight west. Another prominent railroad at the time was the Illinois Central that ran straight south. And I'm especially highlighting the CNNW and the Illinois Central because the Illinois Central, as soon as it opened, there was a fellow by the name of Paul Cornell, whose cousin was the founder of Cornell University. Paul Cornell established a subdivision down on the south side, and he convinced the railroad to stop trains there. But the trouble was the trains didn't run often enough, and they were too expensive, and that was hampering Paul Cornell's ability to develop his subdivision. So he convinced the railroad to do two things. One, to run a whole bunch of trains. And so you see this schedule, Chicago and Hyde Park and Oakwoods trains from the 1870, June 1870 official guide. But the other thing that they did is they started offering volume discounts in terms of 100. You had to buy 100 rides at the beginning. And this was a careful balancing act where the railroad got their money ahead of time. Um, it was a lower fare, but it also by paying having to pay that fare up front, it basically kept the riffraff out in terms of who's got the money to pay for all these tickets at one time. But the term for the volume discount was called commuting the fare, just like you would commute a prison sentence or something like that. Uh, that has been attributed to both to the Illinois Central and to the CNNW going north, but it also may have been something that was already a practice in Boston or in New York to commute the train fares. The point of all of this is to say that the people who rode on these lower price tickets became commuters. So as I mentioned, the other one in the 1850s was the CNNW. I didn't have a schedule from the 1850s, so once again, I'm using the 1870 guide to show that they had what we're all familiar with, trains that come into the city in the morning and go out in the evening. And they had both expresses and locals. And that then was the beginning of um, commuter trains in Chicago. So, meanwhile, back in the city, the horse-drawn omnibuses, well, that was really passable, but they really, in order for them to work the way they needed to, they put them on rails, not just in Chicago, but of course, many, many, many places. Going back to the 1830s, other places. In 1859 in Chicago, um, the um, the first horse car routes were opened. Uh, there's no discussion about Chicago without talking about the fire. The good news is for the horse car operators that none of the car barns were in the path of the fire. So while the ashes were still smoldering, as you see in this image, the horse cars were just out there just doing what they had been doing. So Chicago is the city of Chicago is really divided into three parts: the south side, the west side, and the north side. So on the south side, the streetcar routes evolved substantially into a company called the Chicago City Railway. And this is a franchise map from, well, they're already showing electric lines. So this is already from the late 1890s, but it's here to illustrate the fact that the South Side lines were run by the Chicago City Railway. The West Side lines were operated by the Chicago West Division Railway that at one point changed its name from or to the West Chicago Street Railroad. Um, Same thing, you'll see the concentrated downtown area and then the routes radiating out. Then the north side had the North Chicago Street Railroad. Those up until um, the early 90s, 1890s, were all independent companies. There were also a whole bunch of little companies that were out on the periphery, the Calumet Electric Street Railway and the South Chicago Street Railway and others, but these were the three substantial main companies. So, 1882, oh, they had experimented with all kinds of things, compressed air cars and battery cars, and there was even an attempt to run cars with naphtha that hopefully one never exploded. We would have heard about it, I guess. But what you see here then in this image at the corner of State and Washington, you can tell because the Marshall Field clock is there, is you've got a cable car motor trailer set, but then you still have a horse-drawn omnibus coming around the corner. So, uh, the cable car system was the world's largest cable car system. This illustrates the various routes going on the south side and the west side and the north side. Cable, it was one thing to install horse cars where you put rails in the street and you've got to buy the equipment and all that, but it wasn't in really way crazy capital intensive. And I'll get to why that was important in a moment here. Another thing that happened in the 1880s and 1890s was the evolution of the steam dummies. This is a route on the north side that ran from the north end of the cable car loop going straight north to, I believe it was to Graceland, Graceland Cemetery up on the north side. There was one on the west side that connected with the west end of the streetcar system that extended out through my neighborhood in what's now Oak Park. And there was one on the south side that went down to the Paul Cornell subdivision in Hyde Park. It wasn't until 1890 that the first electric streetcars appeared on the streets. There were two things that kind of retarded immediate adaptation of the big systems. One, they already had an installed base of cable cars and horse cars, and they had their slow shoes on. Hey, we've already put all of our money into this. Let's not just go jumping into this new technology um, until we've paid for what we've got. But the other thing was in Chicago, there was a lot of civic resistance, fear that these overhead wires were going to just suddenly drop, that something was going to snap and these things were going to drop and electrocute the horses and electrocute the pedestrians on State Street. So it did take a lot of calming people down before before there was widespread use of the electric streetcars. And as a result of all of that, there were still horse cars and cable cars on the street in Chicago until 1906. So the 1890s was the golden era of streetcar expansion in Chicago, as it was pretty much everywhere. What this map depicts is what you see in blue is what was already in place, track that was already in place in 1890, and what is in red was trackage that was opened up um, between 1890 and 1900. A couple of notable extensions, one going way north out of Chicago into Evanston. This one going west was the Cicero and Proviso Street Railway, named for the two townships that it ran through. And then coming out also to the west was the Ogden Street Railway. Those were initially independent companies. I should also mention the one going straight south that was affiliated with the Chicago and Interurban Traction Interurban. Those would become important because for a while, they were integrated into the system until they were a financial drag on the company, and there was after a lot of financial turmoil early in the century, in the new century, 20th century, um, there was what was called the settlement ordinance. And the settlement ordinance said, okay, the streetcar systems can have a new franchise, uh, but in order to achieve some level of profitability, they were able to snip the lines off at the city limits. And as a result, to this day, the CTA bus routes substantially come to the city limits, and then suburban bus routes take up from there because of this settlement ordinance from all a long time ago. So, how did a lot of this turmoil happen? Well, we had our person in town, Charles Tyson Yerkes, villain and hero. He engaged in whatever ruthless business practice he needed uh, to to get his systems built and to make sure that he and his close associates got handsome remuneration from operation of the streetcar system, regardless of the profitability. So, in essence, what they did is happened with so many transportation systems of the time. You watered the stock. You sell a really lot of stock, much more than you need, in a way to as a way to bolster your own income. When there's a dividend, you get a really handsome dividend. Ruthless business methods. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to the opening of the loop elevated system. That the the way the law was written in terms of getting permission to operate on a street, what you had to do was get the approval of the majority of the property owners facing that street. What the law didn't say was that the property owners had to be in the place where the tracks were going to be. And so when it was time to open the or to get permission to run the loop elevated, they would go, for example, on Van Buren Street and go way, way out, blocks and blocks and miles out on Van Buren Street. Well, you're a Van Buren Street property holder. Uh, we'll offer you this small amount of money in terms of a bribe to say yes, you're all in favor of this. And so the people in the area where the tracks were going to build, the merchants really didn't want that. Uh, they got outvoted because of this loophole. But this was an example of Yerke's methods. He bribery and blackmail in defense of Charles Yerkes. It was kind of the way stuff was done at the time in Chicago. That was bribery was called boodle. So he was looked upon in the city as a villain, but in fact, he did really a lot of good stuff. He consolidated and modernized the North Side and West Side streetcar systems. He founded the Chicago Union Traction Company, actually for the purpose of packaging it up for sale. Uh, owned and modernized the Lake Street Elevated. He was the driving force to create the Loop Elevated that we'll talk about in a moment, and financed the Northwestern Elevated Railroad Company. So he, as was so much the time, was William Vanderbilt wasn't the only one who to sticking his foot in his mouth when he was trying to explain something. That was the one about the public be damned. In this case, there was a stockholders meeting, and somebody was saying, "Well, we get a lot of complaints from the riders that the cars are really, really crowded, and why can't people have seats?" And what he said was, as I'll read what you see on the screen, the short hauls and the people who hang on the steps are the ones we make our money out of. We make no money on the man who has a seat and rides the end of the line. That got distilled down to the strap hangers pay our dividends. And I can tell you as a transit planner, just that Charles Yerkes was right that when we would evaluate routes for whether they were meeting financial criteria as we shepherded the taxpayers' money in the current environment, it was the ones where everybody has got a seat that were a little challenging on the budget that we needed to stay on ease. So Yerkes was right. So this is what the mayor had to say. He was a really gallant but perverted soul that looked danger in the face unflinchingly. He was the stuff great war heroes are made of. With the right moral fiber, he would have been a truly superb character. And as many of you know, he probably went on to London and was responsible for getting a lot of the underground built. it took that kind of ruthlessness to do that sort of thing. So I mentioned that he he took the north side and the west side routes, consolidated them first into the Chicago Consolidated Traction Company and then the Chicago Union Traction to get it all packaged up for sale. And he kind of slid a fast one over on the people who bought it, who actually had been his previous partners and should have known better. But in the wake of Yerke's departure, uh, there was financial turmoil, uh, both in terms of in financing a transit system, you needed a franchise long enough that the investors were going to know that they were going to get their money out of it. The state and city regulators wanted short franchises, and that was the bone of contention. But also, all that watered stock had really created a difficult financial uh, structure right at the time when it was necessary to replace the old single truck streetcars with double truck streetcars. So there was the Chicago Union Traction Company made it to 1908 before it needed to be reorganized again as Chicago Railways, and that lasted until 1914 when when I'm going to pause for a moment and just say this was an extreme version of what was going on in the city. This was about 1911. Bruce Moffat here in Chicago, one of the most knowledgeable people there is about transit history, says there was some kind of problem. There was some kind of a strike going on or something. But nonetheless, it was representative of what it was like to try to run the transit system. You're not getting a lot of productivity out of these cars, and you have a lot of unhappy people as riding on the cars as well. So congestion, this kind of congestion was also adding to the financial drain. So in 1914, an agreement was reached where you used to have these separate companies where people had to pay separate fares, and I really didn't like that. So various means were devised to unify the service and the and have a single fare all the way through the system. So the underlying companies, Chicago City Railway, Chicago Railways, and several of the other little companies, Chicago, Calumet and South Chicago, uh, went together on a what amounted to a joint operating company. The underlying companies were still there all the way through the 1920s and 30s until eventually the CTA takeover. But it was the Chicago Surface Lines that was the face uh, of the surface transportation system. People from our era, I say our era, uh, I'm 75 and I never saw a red car actually run in service. But this is what the surface lines was most known for, was this style of car. In the 1920s, they did get various kinds of safety cars, and some of the best pre-PCC cars were the Peter Witt sedans. Then in 1936, though the surface lines itself was bankrupt, they were able to scratch the money together to buy 83 PCC cars. This was out on the west side of Chicago when the cars were introduced. It was a rather enthusiastic reception. So a couple of little oddities on the system. One was the streetcar post office that rambled about the system. And if I understand correctly, there was a mail slot in the thing where you could just, if it came down the street, you could just drop your letter in there. But it functioned somewhat like a railroad RPO, but just roaming around the streets of Chicago. I think other cities had similar services, but I'm highlighting this one because it's Chicago. The other one that was a I'll stop short of calling it fun. It was an interesting operation. Was Cook County Hospital Car number one that was outfitted to take people from the Chicago Hospital for the Insane, whatever the name of it was, the real name of it was, down on the near west side of Chicago, out to the Dunning State Hospital, and then down to the state of Illinois Manteno mental hospital where it would run down on the Chicago and Interurban Traction Company to get down there. It was known as the asylum car, and it had a particular schedule. I think it was 1 day a week that it made its trip out to the Dunning mental hospital out on the northwest side of Chicago. It was outfitted with security and nurses, and then, of course, the inmates themselves. A little side note about the hospital that was in the city, the psychiatric hospital, was next to the baseball park that preceded Wrigley Field. And there is an expression you'll hear, "Oh, that's just out in left field." What the Where that came from is the baseball stadium was next to the psychiatric hospital. It was over the left field fence. So people at the baseball game, when they were just having their chitter chatter when the game was getting a little slow, is what are you talking about? You're just crazy. I mean, you're so crazy. You're way out in left field. So just an expression that has now found its way into American usage. So this thing ran from 1918 to 1939. It was built in the company shops, but it was actually owned by Cook County. So as we got on farther along, competition arose. Chicago has got a boulevard system that back in the 20th century, the boulevards were actually managed by the Chicago Park District, not the city. And the Chicago Motor Coach Company was able to get franchises to operate on the boulevards where the streetcars weren't allowed to run. So they established this company and had a route structure that ran all over the city, sometimes in direct competition with the streetcars just on a couple streets over. It was also known their moniker was polite transportation. That's kind of a little jab at perhaps the demeanor of some of the Chicago Surface Lines employees. The Chicago Surface Lines themselves adopted gas buses for some of the outlying routes in 1927. And in 1927, the Chicago Surface Lines also introduced trolleybus operations. Uh, there was in the late 1920s, when there was a big expansion of residential districts out on, especially on the northwest side, um, Surface Lines and Chicago Motor Coach went nose to nose trying to get franchises. And it was finally kind of settled that it was the Surface Lines who were entitled to run those, that the motor coach really should be confined, generally speaking, to the boulevard system. What was important is there wasn't any meaningful substitution of these. These were not, except in isolated incidences, they were not replacing streetcars. The system reached its peak in about 1937 with over 1,000 miles. The red routes that you see were not all streetcars. I'm hopeful that I can expand this so you can see the nuance here, that if it's a solid line, it was a streetcar line, and the dashed lines that you see out in the northwest suburbs that I alluded to earlier were either motor buses or trolley buses. The one place where there was a streetcar replacement, Diversey Avenue, had some bits and pieces of streetcar route that was, when they put in the trolley bus, then The trolley bus came from the city limits because of that settlement ordinance and wouldn't go beyond. East to Western Avenue, Diversey continues on over to the lakefront, but Diversey over to the lakefront is a boulevard. And so that actually was a route where Chicago Motor Coach operated as far as Western Avenue, and the streetcar, I mean, the trolley buses then ran beyond. So once again, to emphasize, there had been no meaningful conversion of streetcar operations to buses. The surface lines was very much committed to um, streetcar operation. Oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. So uh, one of the things that was maybe a little bit of a harbinger of things to come, deep in the Depression, Chicago wanted a subway, and there was a mechanism in the financing for the city to come up with the local match, but they just didn't have the money to just dig the whole subway. But there were all of the alphabet agencies, and notably the Public Works Administration, that was headed up by my mind's gone blank. I've got to look down here. Ickes, Harold Ickes. He was from Chicago and had an ongoing feud with the mayor of Chicago. Now, Ickes is in Washington, D.C. as the head of the uh, Public Works Administration. The city, there were several things. One is the city had delivered a huge vote for Franklin Roosevelt in the 1936 election. So if the city wants something, it's going to get it. But so the city then, and they wanted this subway, so they filed a grant with the public applied for a grant from the Public Works Administration for the State Street subway and two streetcar subways. Now, one of the things that I'm not going to get into the particulars of, there were actually three tunnels underneath the Chicago River that just went under the river and then came back to the surface. But there was an expectation that these tunnels would be extended east to Grant Park near the lakefront as streetcar subways, the same way as you have it in Boston or Philadelphia or San Francisco. The grant was filed, and um, Ickes came back a short time, not very much longer, and partly I think to want to kind of stick his thumb in the eye of Mayor Kelly, said, "You can have the money." And Ickes didn't have any choice in the matter; he had to give it some money. But he said, "You can have the money, and here's the money for the State Street subway. You're not getting the streetcar subways. We are amending your grant to give you something that you didn't ask for, and that is a whole second subway under Dearborn Street, and we will get to that in a little bit." So that was the streetcar subways that never happened, and ultimately I think had a big impact on why there aren't any more streetcars in Chicago now. So, Chicago Surface Lines being committed to streetcar operation, um, even though they were bankrupt, they were able to order 600 of what became known as the Green Hornet PCC cars. The pre-war cars had been known as the Blue Goose cars. This, as I'm showing this picture, not just to feature a Clark Street streetcar, but the location is next to Wrigley Field up on the north side when there was a railroad line that went. We're going to revisit this railroad line in a little bit. This was the Milwaukee Road back in the 1800s, built their own route to Evanston in competition with the CNNW. And this will come back into our story in a little bit. These tracks were still there when I was in, I don't know, in fourth or fifth grade. This is completely transformed now. The new owners of the Cubs have bought up all of the property around here, and it's gotten to be quite quite urban in a modern sense. So I mentioned those outlying routes. With the settlement ordinance of whatever year that was, 11-ish or so. Um, there were two notable systems that were they were snipped at the county line. I mean at the city limits. This is the city limits. The photographer has got his back to the huge Western Electric telephone manufacturing plant where about 40,000 people worked at that place in its peak. So those are the familiar red Chicago surface lines streetcars. When they had the snipping of the wires, they had an interim company called County Traction Company that was in financial distress for its brief history, and it was got reorganized as the Chicago and West Towns Railways. And this was the system that lasted all the way up until 1948. This huge crowd of people getting on the car it's probably shift change at Western Electric, but it also might be that they're getting on the streetcar because it went out to the Brookfield Zoo that was opened in the 1930s. It was a huge traffic generator for the Westtown system. This was the extent of the routes. Here again, you'll see how they were snipped at the city limits. It had actually been a consolidation of the old Cicero and Proviso Street Railway that ran through Oak Park and River Forest, and the Ogden Street Railway and another company called the Suburban Railroad that all were amalgamated into the Chicago and West Towns streetcar system. The other one, as I mentioned, was Evanston Railway that was ran north from Howard Street, where the red line L ends now, that being the north city limits. Another company that ran a little bit into the city was the Hammond, Whiting, and East Chicago Railway, not part of that settlement ordinance because it was an Indiana company that ran through Northwest Indiana, uh, coming down from the bustling, it's kind of a secondary downtown of South Chicago, um, down Sheffield Avenue past what up until very recently has been the South Shore Station, except it's getting moved. Um, Another route that came over through East Chicago, through an industrialized area. Uh, we'll say goodbye to the streetcar system. There were actually, as mentioned, there were these other little companies, but we'd be here all night if we went into that kind of detail. So let's go on to the rapid transit. The rapid transit system. One thing about old maps of the rapid transit system in Chicago, normally maps show north as being at the top end, but because Chicago is kind of uh, longer than it is wide, this is how they were customarily presented back in the day. So I'm going to now go through the underlying companies. Early, the early proposal for the Lake Street line was going to be this. And I think that it would have been interesting, but I'm kind of glad that they came up with more conventional technology. So the first electric elevated railroad in Chicago it was not even part of the present L system. It was part of the World's Fair, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, and it ran around around the fairgrounds. There is one building left from the World's Fair that had been, you can see someone, it says art galleries. That's now the Museum of Science and Industry. So this uh, operated just during the World's Fair, and of course there was no reason to run it afterward. Uh-oh, I didn't want to do that.
It looks like you ended the share accidentally.
Yeah, I did. All right, I should be back now.
Yep. Just need to resume slideshow.
Yep. All right. Here we go. So now getting to the so-called real rapid transit, there were four companies. Um, the As you can see, the South Side, the Lake Street, the Metropolitan West Side, and the Northwestern, very much like the streetcars. The South Side ran on the South Side, the Lake Street and Metropolitan, otherwise known as the Met, uh, ran on the West Side, and the Northwestern Elevated was the North Side route. The South Side was the first one that don't be deceived by this map. The loop wasn't there when it was opened. It was opened in phases starting in 1892, um, straight south and then out to Jackson Park where the fairgrounds were. The branches were added later. The Englewood branch that is still there, the Normal Park branch going down Normal Avenue to the Chicago Normal School for teachers that it's now the campus has moved, interestingly, into the former Illinois Central Burnside Shop Complex. So that one reason I'll describe isn't there anymore. There was the Kenwood branch and the Stockyards branch. Both the South Side and Lake Street lines began with steam propulsion. So we'll go on to the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad that came out from downtown on a main stem, this kind of like stem and leaves, where before we talk about the line, I want to talk about these three green splotches. These are major city parks. Chicago in the end of the 1860s had the foresight to establish this chain of city parks and the connecting boulevards, where that way the Chicago Motor Coach Company could run on those. But the parks were named Douglas Park, Garfield Park, and Humboldt Park. Why is that important to us? Because the Met, when they built their branches, they were the Douglas Park branch, the Garfield Park branch, and the Humboldt Park branch, as well as the Logan Square branch that wasn't a park. But what is important here is these are routes that are not named for the streets and they're not named for the residential neighborhoods. They were focused on, oh, this is the route you take when you want to go to one of these parks, because that was in the era before air conditioning or automobiles, and you wanted to get out to some cooler green space, you would take the L, and it was appropriate then for the Met to name these for these parks. The routes eventually were extended much farther west. This is a picture, a map from, I should have looked this up, but it's the company in the late 1890s. The Douglas branch went way out into Berwyn, and we'll talk about that after a while, Cicero and Berwyn. The Garfield Park branch went out as at this time as well to West 48th Street, which is present day Cicero Avenue, and was extended on out into the suburbs. Humboldt never went any farther than the embankment of the Milwaukee Road rail line, and the Logan Square branch went to Logan Square until 1970 when it was finally extended by the CTA. The Lake Street. I don't want you to get distracted by this dashed line. I didn't have a good map of just the Lake Street, but the Lake Street line went out, amazingly enough, it went out on Lake Street. Um, it had a little stub on Market Street that's now Wacker Drive, and they actually did build along one leg of what was later going to be the loop, and that actually figures into the Yerkes plan because Charles Yerkes was the um, owner of the Lake Street L for a period of time. But it came out on Lake Street to 52nd Avenue to the city limits on the elevated structure. And then we'll talk after a while about ground level operations. the L lines competed with one another. So it was the Lake Street's intention to build their own route to Humboldt Park. The Lake Street line did go past the north end of Garfield Park. The Met went through the south end of, past the south end of Garfield Park. So they wanted to get to these parks. The west end of the Lake Street L, I mean, we could make a whole program just talking about the complexity of the West End. As I say, they got to Laramie Avenue, and at that point, um, they went down to ground level. It was also now in the suburbs in the township of Cicero, where they had to get a whole separate set of franchises. They got into a dispute with the township of Cicero about going straight west, where they originally intended to, alongside the CNNW. So they Yerkes also was in control of a company called the Suburban Railroad that was eventually it was the company that operated the streetcar line out to LaGrange, among other things. This had started out as a steam dummy, so the tracks were there, and it was just a matter of stringing overhead wire, and so they ran down effectively in the street in on Randolph Street through Oak Park. And for a period of time, there was a racetrack uh, down here where you see it on the map, and they would run these L trains. It was not regular day in, day out service, but they would come out and down right down a residential street on Cuyler Avenue, across on Harrison Street. Um, the CA&E wasn't there yet, so you didn't have a electric railway crossing an electric railway, but it did cross a steam road down and then out to this racetrack. So a lot of complexity that Bruce Moffat wrote a whole book about this, and actually I did too, about the trackage on Randolph Street. But that's a story for another day. So the Northwestern Elevated Railroad uh, did operate out of the loop right from the beginning, because it was the one that opened up in 1900, the loop having been opened in 1897. And it had its main stem going straight north up to Wilson Avenue, with an elaborate terminal at Wilson Avenue. The Ravenswood branch was opened later in 1907. But at Wilson Avenue, that's where things got interesting. This was all on just regular elevated structure. I might mention in Chicago, the the South Side L, except for the part on 63rd Street, was all on private right of way. The Lake Street was all over the street. The Met was all over the street, and this was also on private right of way. So it got, as I say, it got interesting north of Wilson Avenue, because I I'm going to reverse the order of these pictures. As I mentioned, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, the predecessor of the Milwaukee Road, was already operating a route from downtown Chicago up to Evanston, in competition with the CNNW, with these steam engines, and you can see there are freight cars along the side. It was basically a freight and passenger railroad. I hate to think about what the condition was of that laundry up there in the turret after two or three steam engines had gone by, but I guess they didn't have a lot of choice in the matter, in terms of they didn't have an automatic dryer in their basement. So you had this steam suburban service, and it was a convenient thing then for the Northwestern Elevated to enter into an agreement with the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul to string wires, that the CM and St. P then no longer operated the passenger service, but continued to provide freight service all the way up to Evanston, all the way into the CTA era. So this is at Argyle Avenue, it's all intensely urban right now, but there's many of you may be familiar with the Shoreline Interurban Historical Society, that has effectively an annual bulletin called the Dispatch. And there's a wonderful this dispatch number 2 tells the whole story of the evolution from the Milwaukee Road or the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul suburban service up through the CTA or through the Chicago Rapid Transit era. So we'll move on to describe the Union Loop. Uh, as I say, that was something with these three companies. They knew that they had to come up with a system for getting better penetration into the central business district. And it took the ruthlessness and creativity of Charles and ability and fundraising abilities of Charles Yerkes to actually get the thing built. This is at Tower 18 at Lake and Wells. So the Lake Street trains ran crosswise here. If you went straight ahead, that would be going up on the northwestern elevated, and then the train at the lower right is signed up Logan Square. That's to say that's a what would have been a metropolitan train that was going around the loop, and it was going to go out then kind of the south end of the loop to go west on that stem and leaf arrangement. So this is a map of the loop in the early days. One of the things I found interesting about this that somebody wasn't doing the proofreading, but they spoke like a real Chicagoan. Inner loop track south side. Same thing on the other side here. So it's substantially unchanged. The routings have been changed over the years, but it's a double track going around. Eventually, the metropolitan thing was snipped off later on when the Congress route was open. Down at the lower left, the old Congress stub, that was the original uh, north end of the South Side um, rapid transit. So that was the loop. The other person, you can't have a program about an explanation of Chicago Transit without invoking the name of Samuel Insull. Insull was sent to Chicago by Thomas Edison himself to set up a power distribution system for Edison's new system for providing electric lights and electricity for motors and stuff in people's houses. So Samuel Insull established the Commonwealth Edison Company to do that. The rapid transit lines were also in financial turmoil, and he wound up, they were a very, very good customer. And he didn't want for them to go out of business. I don't know how they would have, but he basically wound up owning the uh, the rapid transit routes. They set up an interim company called the Rapid Transit. I can't think of the name of it now. Kind of a cooperative trust, vaguely like the surface lines where there were still the individual companies. But it was Insull who had both the deep pockets and the determination, and sometimes almost the same kind of ruthlessness as Yerkes uh, to consolidate the whole rapid transit system into the Chicago Rapid Transit Company. And at that point, the underlying companies went away. They rapid transit companies then came to have uh, give the L the appearance that people of our generation and younger would kind of have a better sense of. So the 4000 series cars actually started appearing on the property. The earlier ones without the trolley poles went back to the teens. These started appearing in the 1920s and actually were ordered from Cincinnati Car Company before the Rapid Transit Company, but they were kind of the face of the Rapid Transit Company. The Rapid Transit Company, working with Insull, here was the Insull business model. He's got this power company. He wants to continue to expand his company and find new markets. Well, how do you find new markets for people using electric lights? Well, they'll have electric lights if they have houses, and they'll have houses if they have suburbs. and they'll have suburbs if somebody can get to the suburbs. So, uh, Insul, then that's the model that's on how we wound up acquiring the North Shoreline and the South Shoreline and the CA&E was that by beefing up these companies, it would develop these suburbs and he would sell a lot of electric power. So in this case, they extended over the North Shoreline. Had previously, I'll talk about the North Shoreline in a moment, but the North Shoreline ran on the along through the North Shore suburbs. But in 1926, they opened the Skokie Valley bypass route. Uh, it was already in construction in 1925. So the sister company, the Rapid Transit, extended rapid transit service over the North Shoreline to Niles Center, that's present day Skokie. If you went and stood right there today, you would be at the north end of the what we now call the Yellow Line, but is popularly known as the Skokie Swift. This is a station roof that you see in the upper left is one of the very distinctive um, stations that building is still there. It's been moved to a site away from the present Skokie line, but it was still there. The important thing, though, one of the important things is you see this train and all these people, and this is really a wonderful thing that we have train service. And when you look out to the side, what do you see? Well, there's nothing. Houses haven't been built yet. And the problem was the flaw in the business model was that the housing market was just about to tank just when they opened this. They had no way of knowing that. I'll invoke the name of Yogi Berra, the baseball player, who said, making predictions is always difficult, especially when it involves the future. And in this case, they predicted that there would be endless prosperity and homes would be developed and there would be the need for trains this long to haul all of these people to and from the city. So we'll now go to the other rapid transit extension going west to Westchester. Uh, Almost the same business model in a slightly different order. This was also going to be a bypass route for the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin that we'll talk about in a moment. Uh, so the bypass route would go way, way out to Warrenville, quite near to Aurora, and the innermost part would be a rapid transit extension, very much like the one to Skokie. They opened to uh, first to Roosevelt Road, which is up there on the marshland up in the left-hand side of the picture, and they opened down here to 1930, which is already the Depression. You'll see in the upper right here, they're advertising the homes and whatnot. But this basically was what it looked like right up until they tore up the tracks in the 1940s. It was an admirable idea, but the timing was all wrong. So this is what the CA&E bypass would have looked like. The regular CA&E came out through Elmhurst, Lombard, Glen Ellen, Wheaton, where it's split, as you'll find out shortly. One branch going to Elgin, another branch going to Aurora, and this would have then reconnected with the Aurora branch. But a couple things about this. This has got a median strip operation. So it that kind of introduced that concept to Chicago, even though it never got built. Uh, it also this is not a transit thing. This is from the DuPage County, what amounted to the DuPage County Highway Authority. The plan got far enough along that they actually acquired the right of way, the 200-foot right of way. And to this day, Butterfield Road has got this huge, wide right of way. It just doesn't have all of these stately 1920s homes that were projected at that time. So, coming back to the rapid transit system, by the 1930s, This is what the rapid transit system looked like. The south side that we already talked about with the main stem and the various branches. The Metropolitan by this time had extended its branches out. Uh, the Douglas Park branch going out to Oak Park Avenue in Oak Park. The Garfield Park branch going out to Des Plaines Avenue in what's present day Forest Park, with this extension uh, going out over the CA&E out to Westchester. Uh, the two Humboldt Park and Logan Square, the Lake Street, and the uh, the North Branch going up to Howard Street. There is the Niles Center extension, and then the North Shoreline Skokie Valley route and the North Shoreline route. So all working in concert with one another. So in 1943, thanks to the Public Works Administration grant, where we didn't get the streetcar subways, we did get the State Street subway. So for the first, it was desperately needed. They've been planning this thing since planning for a subway for decades, but never could get a combination of resources and agreement all at one time to be able to get it built. So the old South Side L came up, the Congress Street terminal remained as a important place through the end of the North Shoreline because that was the North Shoreline's baggage office. Here's the Loop L, the former metropolitan routes going west, the Lake Street going west. The Lake Street had their little spur. The Loop L got so crowded that the various underlying companies actually began originating trains separately at these little stub terminals. On the north side, they had one just north of the or east of the Merchandise Mart called the North Water Terminal. So we had a subway for the first time. Now, the challenge that was presented is thanks to the Malbone Street wreck and other things, it was you don't run wood cars in the subway. So that meant that the Rapid Transit Company, who still was the Rapid Transit Company, had to reassign all of their steel cars to just about all of them to the State Street subway, and it created a desperate need for new cars. So this was an experimental project to get these four three section articulated cars. It kind of modeled, I think, after the Bluebird cars in New York. So these were delivered. They actually didn't get delivered until after the CTA took over. The picture that you see here with these cars coming west is on the old Metropolitan Main Line. It's just crossed the Chicago River, and the tan things you see in the background on the side over here is the lead tracks into Union Station. For several years, I had my office right up in the Insurance Exchange building where I could have looked out at the CA&E, but it wasn't there. So, subways. Chicago had passenger subways, but they also had freight subways. So, starting in 1906, the Chicago Tunnel Company established this network of these little routes, so it's all electrified, throughout the downtown area to bring in heating coal for downtown buildings, to take the ash out, but also for the department stores. There were railroad freight terminals or LCL terminals around where the passenger stations were down on the south side. So you would just, when inbound merchandise would come in, it would get loaded onto these little cars and get taken all around the downtown area. The system lasted, it was already getting obsolete with trucks, but it actually lasted until the final death knell was the opening of what's now the Kennedy Expressway, that it severed their connection to either car barn or something. And by that time, it was going to die anyway. But a later story about this. Most of those things are still there. They're largely sealed off, and there was an incentive to seal them off after a 1992, if I remember right. There was some pile driving going on next to the Kinsey Street Bridge, and the pile driver, somebody, they misjudged where they were driving the piles, and they punctured the tube next to the river, and the tunnels flooded, causing great havoc. It flooded the basements of many buildings, disrupted communication systems. It was a mess. And so it gave renewed enthusiasm to seal these things off. So, what now? There's a blank screen. Why is that? It's intermission time. Pay toilet 5 cents. And we are going to proceed with interurbans. This map shows beautiful spots near Chicago that can be reached by interurban. I'll especially point out Starved Rock State Park down here as a really scenic location that you could take the Chicago and Joliet or the Rock Island Railroad down there, and then you took horses and wagons, I guess, to get out to the park. Anyway, the interurban network was actually rather complete as you would expect to find in the Midwest. I will highlight certain of the interurbans. We of course can't talk about them all, but we'll certainly talk about the high profile ones. Maybe the most beloved is the North Shoreline. Uh, it started out as a streetcar line in North Suburban Waukegan and North Chicago, and then eventually morphed into the interurban by extending south from Waukegan. Well, actually, started out in Waukegan, and then they extended it down to Evanston, and in 1919 negotiated an agreement with the um, Northwestern Elevated Railroad to come on down into downtown Chicago. And actually, for a number of years, it went all the way down to Jackson Park. The Jackson Park, where the World's Fair had been, it was a Tony neighborhood back in the 1920s, and so it was appropriate. Um, to run the service through as they're called, the leafy North Shore suburbs. A little bit about Chicago geography. Because we're along the lake, there is the North Shore and the South Shore. So those railroads didn't get their names in a vacuum. That's what there's all when you go up through the northern suburbs, you'll find all kinds of shoreline this and shoreline that, um, commemorating the North Shore commemorating the North Shore as a physical feature, uh, and it became appropriate Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee. In 1926, they opened the Skokie Valley route, partly to provide faster service and compete more effectively in the Kenosha, Racine, and Milwaukee market, but also so that Insull's Commonwealth Edison will have hopefully more houses with residents who would buy electricity. It also had a little branch line that went out to Mundelein. The North Shoreline was probably most known for its 1941 electroliner streamlined trains built by St. Louis Car Company. Second one was the CA&E, originally built as I'm going to jump ahead here for a moment. It was originally the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago, and was connecting those places. Uh, the the main stem, double track route to Wheaton, then with single track branches to Elgin and Aurora and Batavia. Then later, they opened the line over to Geneva and extended it around to to St. Charles. That one never did really well and wound up getting discontinued in 1937. But the railroad itself was like interurbans everywhere. It experienced its bankruptcy. It was the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago was then in the very early 1920s, Dr. Thomas Conway of Philadelphia and Western and Cincinnati and Lake Erie fame, his group took it over and started the modernization that then was finished by the Insull administration, who took over in about 1925 or so. A couple of notable little spurs here. We already talked about the Westchester spur that would have then arced around through the community of Utopia down to Warrenville and reconnect. But the other one was a little spur line that went to Mount Carmel, which was a cemetery that we're going to talk about in a moment. So this picture was on the Aurora branch. This now is the if you were to go there right now, it's a sea of office parks, not recognizable in the least. So as I say, the company was opened in 1902. The route was opened in 1902 as far as 52nd Avenue, now Laramie Avenue on the west side. There apparently was an intention from the beginning that they would have a connection over the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad, and it worked out very well, a mutual agreement that the CA&E could operate their trains into downtown Chicago. This is the Wells Street Terminal on the southwest corner of the downtown district. And the L trains that were at that time just going out as far as 52nd could then be extended out through the newly incorporated suburb of Oak Park and Forest Park to a substantial amusement park out in the west side. So that was a mutually beneficial connection for them to do that. So the CA&E then operated into downtown Chicago until 1953, when the Congress Expressway was being built. The Garfield L, the former Metropolitan, was right in the path of the expressway. It was necessary to move the Garfield Park out of the L out of the way of the expressway on a ground level operation that the CA&E was unwilling to operate on the ground level operation. There was a lot of intrigue associated with that. There is one of those shoreline dispatches that tells that whole story, and I should know because I'm the guy who wrote it. So anyway, it was cut back in 1953 to a loop-in-loop terminal where the CA&E trains would have come around on a counterclockwise loop, and the L trains came around. I think they were both counterclockwise. Anyway, you see old. These were the 1913 era 4000 series cars, what were called baldies, because they didn't have trolley poles. Who they had a cross the platform connection, but ridership was already declining. The new owners of the CA&E, quite frankly, had no interest in continuing passenger service anyway. The Westchester route had been discontinued in 1951, and that bus you see over there is the Westchester Extension bus. And I'm either proud or sorry to say that the final end of the Westchester service bus route actually happened on my watch as a bus planner, that we turned that over to Pace Suburban bus service because it was ridiculous for the CTA to be running this bus out through the western suburbs just because there had been an L that very few people rode decades earlier. So that was the CA&E. We're going to now, a couple interesting things. That Mount Carmel branch that I mentioned was the reason it was there was funeral service. They had these cars that were specially outfitted where you could just slide the casket in through there. The mourners then could ride um, in the rest of the car with the deceased. There were designated L stations that they needed to have elevators because they're not going to schlep that casket up the narrow and twisting stairways. I guess those stations were accessible in their own special way. So they came out on the Metropolitan West Side elevated railroad. There were cemeteries at Forest Park near that amusement park that I described, and then but these trains came on the CA&E past the place where the Westchester line eventually turned off, and then came down and around to Mount Carmel. The tracks actually went right into the cemetery, and there was a station on the property uh, at the Mount Carmel Cemetery. So we'll move on to the third of the high profile interurbans, the Chicago Lakeshore and South Bend Railroad. I love the symmetry that in both the North Shore and the South Shore, it's where it was on one end, where it was on the other end, and it ran along the shore. So the Lakeshore also started out as a local Northwest Indiana streetcar line that evolved into an interurban that ran from Northwest Indiana through Michigan City and then out through the rolling prairies out to South Bend. They actually had a station at one time called Rolling Prairie. So the South Shoreline also got off to a kind of a difficult start. They had originally electrified with really bulky AC um, propulsion that really was still in its infancy, and it had caused all kinds of difficulty. It was heavy. Uh, the railroad didn't have a lot of business. It was a substantially undeveloped area. Gary was just developing as the company town for U.S. Steel. Uh, it ran along what's still very sparsely populated territory, except for Michigan City, all the way to South Bend. So, um, Chicago Lakeshore and South Bend descended into bankruptcy. Uh, it piqued the curiosity of Samuel Insull, and he sent his son out to look over the property. And he said, "We need to do something in northern Indiana because that's going to be the next place that people are going to want to build thousands and thousands and thousands of houses." So have a look at this railroad. And they went out and looked at this one. They looked at the Chicago South Bend and Northern Indiana Railroad, one of the minor lines we'll talk about in a moment. But they chose to acquire and completely rebuild the Chicago Lake Shore and South Bend. They changed the power system to um, 1200 or 1600 volts, I can't remember which, DC, to be compatible with the newly electrifying Illinois Central suburban service. So this is at the South Bend terminal in the well, it's actually already after the Insull era. The Insull's whole empire was was built on a scheme of holding companies to minimize the amount of investment he would need to have in each of the companies, but with really leveraged financial arrangements. With the coming of the Great Depression, the whole Insull empire collapsed and all of the companies went into bankruptcy. But fortunately, he had rebuilt this to very high standards, and in the case of all three of the companies, developed substantial carload freight business, which wound up being their salvation, at least uh, for a while. So it then brought about the South Shoreline as we have known it in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s. This was on a CERA fan trip sometime in the about 1968. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the other interurbans. The three that were major because they had access to downtown Chicago. Chicago and Joliet, running out along the southwest side, um, didn't ever get access. It came to Cicero and Archer, many miles from downtown Chicago, so it wasn't practical to develop a serious commuter business because you've already come in all this way and now you have to get on the and ride the length of the Archer Avenue streetcar, or even worse, you come up to Lyons and you would take the West Towns car up to the Western Electric where you saw that West Towns picture, and then take the Surface Lines car into town. Not happening. Fortunately for the Chicago and Joliet, there was a substantial place called Argo Cornstarch uh, out here at the place appropriately named Argo. They also had a pretty good recreational business. They had their electric park down at Delwood Park, but they also connected with the Illinois Terminal subsidiary, Chicago, Ottawa, and Peoria, or Chicago and Illinois Valley, depending on what year it was, that would take people out to the Starved Rock State Park and some of the other places. So the Chicago and Joliet lasted until 1933, but uh, without carload freight or without access to downtown Chicago, like interurbans in general, it was doomed. One of the interesting operating characteristics about the Chicago and Joliet is they had a substantial amount of trackage along Archer Avenue with double track with a track on either side of the highway. So it's kind of like double side of the road. This building was just torn down maybe 5 years ago, was a car barn, and it lasted as the landmark restaurant. It was wonderful in the lobby. They had Chicago and Joliet pictures uh, commemorating why the building was there. It was a substation, and you can see a little car barn. They looks like they stored the snow sweeper there. The huge smokestacks you see in the background, that was Argo cornstarch. And so that, as I mentioned before, did provide a good source of ridership. Another interurban that didn't go downtown was the Chicago and Interurban Traction that had a pretty good territory in terms of build up. It ran from the south side of Chicago, the connection with the L, down to Blue Island, Harvey, Chicago Heights, and then Manteno, where the state hospital was, and then Kankakee, which was a pretty substantial community in its own right. But once again, without access to downtown Chicago, they weren't going to have commuter traffic, and they did not develop carload freight business. It met its end when the Illinois Central electrified its suburban service, and the Illinois Central basically served almost the exact same territory. So it only lasted about a year after the Illinois Central electrified. So this was the terminal where it met the Englewood branch uh, of the South Side Rapid Transit Company. So we'll come back to this map just to acknowledge the other routes beyond Milwaukee was the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light that operated a whole network of its own. Out in the Fox Valley, there was a somewhat substantial interurban, the Aurora, Elgin, and Fox River Electric that ran from Carpentersville in the north through a whole series of substantial communities down to Yorkville. At one point, they connected with the Fox and Illinois Union to go down to Morris, and there was the hapless Chicago Aurora and DeKalb that only lasted till about 1924. Aurora, Plainfield, and Joliet, basically forming almost a semicircle all around the city. Joliet and Eastern, really, really marginal companies that only made it partway into the 1920s. But it was a network. The Chicago and New York Electric Airline built their little piece down here south, a little more southerly than Gary. In fact, I think uh, hopefully Bill Shapotkin can put something in the chat if he's on there about whether some of their track became part of Gary Railway's local interurban. There was the Chicago, South Bend, and Northern Indiana. And ultimately, through these connections, you went down and you could make connections to the whole vast network in of interurbans in Indiana and Ohio. I should also mention in terms of transportation, all of these steamship routes. That was a major way of getting around was also on the boats, but the boats are something for another program. So we're going to now go into phase three of the program. We're going to bring things up into um, more modern times. In 1947, after years of wrangling, um, part of the going back to that thing where we didn't get the streetcar subways, Harold Ickes attached a whole bunch of conditions to the money for the South Side, I mean, for the State Street subway. And one of them was you have to take um, continuous steps towards consolidating the transit systems into one systematic system. Uh, and so in 1947, that finally happened. The very bankrupt Chicago Rapid Transit and the very bankrupt Chicago Surface Lines were acquired. In 1952, over the Chicago Motor Coach's objections, they were still doing pretty well. They were also acquired as part of this effort to consolidate and coordinate Chicago's transit system. One of the things, because these had been separate companies, they competed with one another, and there were stations effectively every 2 blocks on the rapid transit. Uh, Also, going to these various little places that weren't generating a lot of business. So when the transit authority took over, they said, here's what the buses do, what the buses do. The rapid transit does what the rapid transit does. We're going to have free transfers between all of these things. If you they discontinued many stations to speed up the service. Basically, the business model was expected to be that with sped up service, without all of these stations, by snipping away these branches that I'll talk about in a moment, um, and eliminating all this duplicated operation, and with modernizing the system, that it was expected to be self-sustaining from the fare box. Well, we all know how that story ended up. But in the meantime, that was the intention. So the CTA took an immediate evaluation and looked at the ones that just in their evaluation didn't need to be there. The little normal park branch, the stockyards, worthy of having a program in its own right. It actually went around in a loop right over the stockyards, but the stockyards were already in decline. The Kenwood line, uh, there were streetcars and buses running along there, as well as the Illinois Central, right along the lakefront. The uh, the Douglas branch to Oak Park was a little different. Rapid Transit or CTA wanted to keep it, but it was all ground level operation for a couple of miles with effectively a grade crossing at every street that required 24-hour watchmen. It was very expensive to operate. The CTA went to the communities of Cicero and Berwyn and said, we can't afford to do this. We'll put in flashing lights and gates and all that stuff. And the city of Berwyn in particular said, no, you have to keep the watchmen. And they said, nope, we're not doing that. So they cut it back to 54th Avenue, where they already had a yard and shop facility. So that's why that one got snipped. We already talked about Westchester, that uh, they operated it for from 1930 to 1945, 15 years, uh, and no houses got built, partly because of the Depression and partly because of World War II. The irony of it was that just as they were tearing up the rails, houses were being built all over the place. Uh, Bruce Moffat has got a wonderful picture, I haven't included it here, of a newly built house with a in the street are the rails that would have gone right into that house. That the rails had just been pulled out and the house was built as fast as the rails were eliminated. Anyway, um, it was deemed to be a loser by the CTA, so they snipped it back. Likewise, the Humboldt Park branch uh, was cut off. The Niles Center branch had never developed any meaningful business, so that one got snipped as well. What the CTA then did to modernize the system, after they had discontinued many of the the stations, they also restructured the rapid transit services, bringing about the north-south configuration going from Howard Street down to Jackson Park and Englewood, and that lasted from 1949 till no the early 90s, I think. We'll get to that. The Ravenswood that used to be through routed with I think with the Kenwood, um, just became a freestanding route. It used to go through the State Street subway, now it became an L route, but this maximized the use of the State Street subway uh, for the main trunk line of the system. Evanston was cut back to a shuttle except during peak periods, where they then ran the Evanston Express trains. Uh, at the same time, they introduced the A and B skip stop service, so that not only did you speed it up because you didn't have nearly as many intermediate stations, but now you had uh, every train acted like an express train in one sense or another. One of the little oddities about this when they started the A and B service was that Belmont, a pretty substantial station, especially today as an anchor station, was only an A station. The Ravenswood trains, it was an A and a B station, and the Evanston Express didn't stop. So here you had a station where, with three trains of three routes past this station, all of the trains of one route stopped there. Some of the trains of another route stopped there, and none of the trains of the third route stopped there. Just a little oddity. So, 1951, uh, the the Milwaukee Dearborn subway, going back to thinking about that stem and leaf, the Logan Square trains had been going out the west side, taking an abrupt right turn, and then going up through the neighborhoods um, before they started angling along next to Milwaukee Avenue. This provided a direct route from Logan Square right into downtown Chicago, into the Dearborn Street subway, which was the thing that the Public Works Administration said, we won't give you money for the streetcar subways, but we will give you money for this whole Milwaukee Dearborn Congress subway. It took a while for it to get opened. There were some internal issues that were delaying it, but also World War II set in, and the State Street subway was so desperately needed that they went ahead and did that one. But this was postponed until after the end of World War II before meaningful construction really got underway. So by the early 1950s, throughout the 1950s, just about, the new Milwaukee Avenue subway came down under Milwaukee Avenue, under Lake Street, under Dearborn, and then made a right turn to the Congress Street Terminal. So if you ride the system today, the legacy of that, there's a scissors crossover there because this was the end of the line from 1951 until 1958. Uh, an interesting piece of trivia about this, for a period of about 3 years, the subway was underneath Lake Street. The Lake Street streetcar was on Lake Street, and the loop elevated was above Lake Street. Tell me another place where three electric railways were stacked, one on top of the other. So just a piece of thing to think about at a later time. Uh, in the 1950s, the Loop L still had its basic configuration. What you don't see is the track going south. It was all still there. It was this non-revenue trackage that then reconnected at Roosevelt Road. No point in showing it on passenger map because there's no trains there. But the former Metropolitan and the Garfield L was still doing what it had been doing. Meanwhile, back at the streetcars, the CTA undertook a determined effort to eliminate the streetcars. I think there was a time when they might have considered having some heavy routes still run, but that soon went away. These PCC streetcars, the post-war cars, were practically brand new. They were delivered after World War II. They were ordered by the surface lines. They were delivered by the CTA, or to the CTA. But by the early 1950s, it was strategically determined that there's not going to be streetcars anymore. So they shipped them all back to St. Louis Car Company, even the streetcars that had been built by Pullman. They were stripped of every part that they could find that could be used in a rapid transit car, and then the rest just scrapped. So by 1954, the system had been reduced to the point where there was no longer a need for the red cars. That all remaining service was with the PCC streetcars. Finally, then June 22nd, 1958, the last streetcar. Just it was 1 year short of 100 years of surface rail operation. Also on June 22nd, the Garfield Park elevated that you see over on the left was replaced by the new Congress line running up the median of the then Congress Expressway. Congress having since been renamed the Dwight D. Eisenhower Expressway. This picture was taken on the day before transition day when the train down here on the lower level was offering demonstration rides on the line, and that the train up there is still on the old Garfield, where that is the elevated structure, except that right there by that building with the sign is a ramp that went down to the temporary trackage that ran along Van Buren Street, the subject of yet another one of those Shoreline Interurban Historical Society dispatch series that Bruce Moffat just dove into the details of the temporary track. So the part down the middle is pretty much the way it looks today. This is called the Morgan Middle Track that is now used for turnback trains. There's a great imbalance now where there's much more ridership on the O'Hare branch and not as much ridership on the what used to be the Congress branch. So they turn a lot of trains on this center track. So there it was in 1958, the introduction of the Congress service. Oh, a little Chicago oddity that you'd have to know about unless you got really sharp eyes. These 6000 series cars have got flat doors. These 6000 series cars have got doors that are flush with the side of the car body. These were the first ones that were delivered in the very early 1950s and were not made out of streetcar parts. These ones, starting in the mid 1950s, these 6000 series and the 1 through 50 series cars were made with the streetcar parts. So, moving right along, 1964, the North Shore Line had gone out of business in 1963. The big problem was that the main Chicago Rapid Transit shop was the Skokie shop on the North Shore Line. So the CTA necessarily had to buy uh, trackage from the North Shore Line in order to keep operation to keep access to the shop. So it was decided, I think this was the brainchild of George Cramble's, CERA member number one, well, why don't we try reopening the Nile Center branch, but without any intermediate stations. They got what, to my knowledge, was the first federal grant for rapid transit infrastructure improvement. And so on April the 28th, um, April 18th, 1964, 60 years ago, they opened this. I think they had maybe 4 cars outfitted for service, and they were figuring, yeah, we're going to try this and see how it works. They were inundated with ridership. The schedules went out the window within the first hour, and they had to retrofit more cars with the special pantographs. They weren't going to do the trolley poles the way the North Shoreline did, because this was one-man operation. And they then utilized those articulated cars that the Rapid Transit had bought uh, way back when, that had been orphans on the system. They finally found a home on the Skokie Swift. So that brought us to the 1960s, where the system started to take the shape that we kind of know today. The Lake Street going around the loop, the Rapid Transit, the Ravenswood going around the loop, the North-South service, and the West-Northwest service, where they had combined the Douglas. Well, they had already been doing Douglas and Congress going in on the previous Met L, except for a time or temporarily the Douglas went up to the Lake Street to go around. But this was west northwest, north south, Ravenswood, and Lake Street, and then the Skokie and Evanston services. But in 1969, then they opened the next expressway median route. This was and the Dan Ryan L going straight south. And then the next year in 1970, actually only a few months later, they extended the Logan Square L out into the median of the Kennedy Expressway to Jefferson Park. We're going to talk about the cars in a little bit here. I'll just have a little summary. But so then the Lake Street then got through routed with the Dan Ryan service, and the rest of the services were still very much the same, the west-northwest, the north-south, and this became known as the west-south route. So the next significant thing that happened on the CTA Rapid Transit was lots of things happened in 1973. The overhead wire north of Howard Street was replaced with third rail. And that then made it possible to run any kind of cars up there. That was one of the reasons the 4000s were still around, is because they had trolley poles. There were some 6000s and the 1 through 50 series cars held down the service, but there weren't enough cars um, to allow retirement of the 4000s. The 4000s by this time, built in 1923, 33, 43, 53, 63, 73. These cars were 50 years old. So another thing that happened in 1973 is the trolley buses were discontinued. Um, and the third thing that happened is the freight service, the legacy of the Northwestern having entered into that agreement with the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul all those years ago. Uh, the company was still regularly, effectively every night, bringing coal up to a coal yard, up off the concrete embankment. Uh, and then you see this one right here. This is a fairly late picture in terms of the automobiles. This is 1960 or later. These would go up to my knowledge, a team track at South Boulevard in Evanston. So this necessitated having gauntlet track all the way along there because otherwise the freight cars uh, would not clear the station platforms. And if I remember right, it required that there was catenary all the way up to Howard Street. Erwin Davis is about to post something to clarify that. At least I hope so. Thank you, Erwin. Um, so at the end of the freight service, then moving on through the history of this rapid transit in 1983, the Kennedy L was extended from Jefferson Park on out to Rosemont, and the next year uh, out to O'Hare Airport. So now the system took on this configuration. Lake and Dan Ryan were still through routed. Congress and Douglas and now O'Hare were all through routed. The North-South service was still doing what it had done since 1949. Ravenswood and the rest of them just doing that. In 1993, the Orange Line opened. A little side note about the Orange Line, where'd the funding come from? Well, it was federal funding. A deal was struck as part of the Iran-Contra affair to um, fund Central American military operations. Ronald Reagan administration wanted the funds for that, and there was a lot of political pushback. And I think it was Daniel Rostenkowski, our local high-powered representative, placed a phone call to Ronald Reagan and said, "I need money for this rapid transit line. Yes, I'll support the military operations, but I need the money for the rapid transit line." And so we got the Orange Line going to Midway Airport. This was a wonderful happenstance. I was just flying in, I think, from Baltimore. And the great thing about Midway Airport is it circle around all over the city. So I was able to get this fun picture of the Orange Line. So what had happened along the way, though, was that when the Dan Ryan line opened, uh, ridership declined greatly on the old South Side L because now people could um, ride the the Dan Ryan line. So there was a terrible imbalance where the riders coming down from Howard Street on the north side required a lot of service, but the Green Line going south didn't require so much service. On the other hand, the Lake Street line uh, what had been through routed with the very heavy Dan Ryan line, which meant there was too much service coming out on the Lake Street line. So they flipped them in 1993, and they had these imaginary characters to introduce the service. L.E. Jack for Lake, Englewood, Jackson Park, and Hodar for the Howard Dan Ryan line. So they became lovable characters that are now largely forgotten in Chicago transit history, but they were there. So 1994, we got the color-coded L routes. In 2006, the Pink Line was opened. The CTA undertook some substantial community feedback meetings out on the west side. What would you like to see? And people, about half the people wanted the Pink Line to go around the loop, and the other half absolutely didn't want it to. But they said, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. So they took the the Douglas Park L that was now going down the big ramp that goes onto the uh, what had been the Congress line. There still was non-revenue trackage north of Congress going up to Lake Street. That is the only connection between the West-Northwest service, Northwest West-Northwest Rapid Transit network, and the rest of the network. So they just activated that and ran the train straight north up to the Lake Street and then around the loop. To celebrate or to promote, they wrapped a whole train in pink wrap. So that brought us to the rapid transit configuration as we know it today. So now when you come and visit to Chicago, you'll instantly remember everything you learned in this program about how these various routes came to be the way they are. Now, one of the things about Chicago that's interesting as a rapid transit network is the number of places that they did operate on the ground with grade crossings. So I'm going to take a moment just to describe these. We already talked about the cutback of the rapid transit from Oak Park Avenue because of the um, crossing guards dispute. But when they cut back to 54th Avenue, there are still one, two, three, four, or maybe five grade crossings in ground level operation. I'm going to jump over that one for a moment. The yellow line, the Skokie Swift, as the legacy of being the North Shore Line interurban at the west end, um, has one, two, three, four, I think four grade crossings. The very north end of the Evanston has got one crossing. And then the Ravenswood was ground level from the beginning at west of Western Avenue. So we'll just look at these visually. There's um, the Skokie Swift, still with the North Shoreline overhead wire supports, that has now been converted to third rail. Evanston, we already talked about with the one crossing at Isabella. The Ravenswood is delightful. It goes down and just kind of bops along through the neighborhoods. Uh, the Douglas route, this is the truncation from going back out to Oak Park Avenue. This is one of the four or so. And then I included Lake Street and Oak Park, even though it was elevated in 1962. It was a fascinating operation because it ran right alongside the already elevated CNW. Uh, that at the time of the CNW elevation, along about 1910 or so, they just didn't elevate the L. Where's Bruce Moffett when we need him? He could probably tell us why that is. I also included this because this route runs a block from my house, and so I have a special liking for this section of line out here. This picture was taken in the summer of 1962, where the train is still on the ground, but the tracks have already been installed up above. When I was in grade school, we lived in the western suburbs, and we would drive oftentimes to Oak Park and take the Lake Street down. And coming back, the windows in the 4000s opened really, really wide. But it was a pretty scary thing to ride alongside with this car rocking back and forth, and the concrete wall is right there. Anyway, that's ground level operation. Um, Let's talk about suburban trains. I got this from the Pennsylvania Railroad. Thank you, Pennsylvania Railroad. This is how I learned about when I was in grade school, how I learned about the geography of downtown, uh, downtown Chicago, Center City, Philadelphia, and Midtown Manhattan because of these cool maps that were in the public in the Pennsylvania Railroad timetables. So just to review, Union Station uh, is the Milwaukee Road, was the Milwaukee Road, Gulf Mobile in Ohio, the Burlington and the Pennsylvania Railroad. CNNW was CNNW. Um, Grand Central was the B&O and the back in the day the Soo Line and the CGW. LaSalle Street was the New York Central, the Nickel Plate, and the Rock Island. Dearborn, a whole bunch of companies that you can read about right there. Um, Central Station was the main station for the Illinois Central, but for our purposes, the suburban service came on up past the Van Buren Street station and the Randolph Street station that wasn't relevant to the PRR, so they didn't put it on the map. But they did put the North Shoreline on the map, and they acknowledged the South Shoreline as well. So back in the day, many railroads operated substantial suburban services, but it basically uh, shook out to a few that we will review. The CB&Q was one of the major ones. This is, as you can see, LaGrange in the 1920s. The CNNW, this is on the embankment in Oak Park with the Lake Street L running along the side. Um, Here was the Milwaukee Road outside of Union Station. But basically, what we're looking at in these pictures is the same train configuration, a locomotive and some really pretty old cars. The Northwestern was doing well to have steel cars at that point. Uh, but this is basically what the configuration was from the 1800s all the way up through the 1940s. They basically, all these services were kind of frozen in time. Here was the Rock Island down on the Blue Island branch, which is effectively a streetcar line with stations about every half mile or so. So uh, that couldn't go on forever. The Burlington undertook a serious study in the late 1940s. They were losing more and more money. What are we going to do? Political circumstances won't allow us to discontinue the service. So, and the Burlington had other issues that they had capacity issues that ridership was growing, but they couldn't add any more cars because of platform lengths. But Union Station had a thing called a wheelage charge where I got charged by the axle. How can we carry more people per axle? And so the Burlington creative minds got together in the late 1940s and came up with gallery cars, as they called them. That's what now we call them bi-level cars, where it was two-level cars with a doorway and then little stairways that would go up to this upper level. So you still had an open corridor in the middle, but it drastically increased the carrying capacity per each car. At the same time, they did dieselize. Uh, they, I'm going to jump back to that. Then in the 1950s, the CNNW followed suit with the bi-level concept, but they added the push-pull cab cars so that you didn't have to turn the trains around at the ends of the route. You'll see a Irving Park trolley bus there in the background. So Burlington then it took until the early 1960s before the Burlington adopted the same configuration as did the Milwaukee Road and the Rock Island. The Milwaukee Road, then this brought us into the many colors time, I guess you could call it, of the suburban railroads in Chicago. I included this picture because that's actually an intercity train. It might be the City of Everywhere, or it might be the City of Everywhere. I call it because of the consolidated Union Pacific trains, or it might be coming down from Milwaukee and they had used a Union Pacific car. This is a suburban train coming out, and there you have the Lake Street elevated going overhead, and then going all the way back to our original story about the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul that went by Wrigley Field and went and became the North Side L. This was the south end. It actually came down into Union Station. And so the whole route, this caboose was here because that whole route was still intact at the time that I took this picture in 1968. The Rock Island still bopping up and down the little suburban line. They had also the main line. I included this just because of the exotic locomotive that was built for intercity service, particularly the Rocky Mountain Rocket got out to Lyman, Colorado, and a section went to Colorado Springs and a section went to Denver, and they didn't want to have to Mickey Mouse around with turning locomotives and doing they wanted to just be able to split the train easily. So they converted or they had a B unit specially uh, configured with this cab to make the trip up from Lyman, the I don't know, 50 miles or so from Lyman to Denver. With the end of Rock Island intercity service, then this got bumped down to suburban service. Uh, those are the routes that had all day service. We'll talk about the IC in a moment. The Gulf Mobile in Ohio operated, 2 or 3 trains in the morning and afternoon rush, down paralleling the old Chicago and Joliet Electric Interurban down to Joliet. The Wabash at one time had a pretty substantial suburban service, but it had dwindled down just to a single train by the time the Norfolk and Western took over in 1964. But the real oomphy service was the Illinois Central that was oomphy right practically from the time that Paul Cornell opened his subdivision. But it was oomphy enough that in the 1920s, the Illinois Central made the strategic decision to electrify, partly because there was an ordinance, this lakefront smoke ordinance that said you couldn't run steam engines north of a particular place, basically north of about Central Station at 12th Street, Roosevelt Road. So they electrified it and basically turned it into a rapid transit operation with high-level platforms and the electrified cars. It was quite a substantial service from Randolph Street coming down the main stem with a very substantial branch down to South Chicago, a less substantial branch going out to Blue Island, and then the main line coming down to Richmond and now a little bit farther. And then they way back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Washington Park Racetrack that used to be at Washington Park moved to the suburbs, and the IC built an electrified spur, so they would run electrified race trains down to Washington Park. That lasted through the 60s and maybe into the 70s. I don't really remember now. So the Illinois Central had those cars from 1926 until 1971 when they got the Highliners. And then in 2005, they got the Highliner 2s that remarkably, technology that was developed in 1949 for the CB&Q was still state of the art in Chicago as late as 2005 and actually effectively still is. And we'll have more about that in a moment. We'll go over the South Shore line. We're at picture 134 out of 165, so we're getting there. In the olden days, when we were in person, you'd be all squirming in your seat saying, "Oh, I got to get to my train. I need to get to New Jersey. I need to get Long Island train. I need to get someplace." But I guess everybody's home now, so I'm taking liberties with more pictures. So the South Shore line, even with the Insel upgrades, it was effectively east of Gary. It was a country interurban with street running through East Chicago, street running in Michigan City, street running in South Bend. It was a country interurban with this is probably Hudson Lake, just a little town hamlet. But the South Shoreline started to grow up, so to speak, or evolve into a commuter railroad in 1956 when the opening of the Indiana Toll Road offered the opportunity for the South Shore Line to get a parallel uh, right of way alongside the highway at minimal cost and eliminate the street running through South Chicago. So they did that. Then in 1967, the next transition from interurban to commuter railroad happened when the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad uh, acquired the company. It had been an Insull property, and then when Insull went bankrupt, it became an independent company. The Monon Railroad had attempted to purchase it, but they did not succeed. But in 1967, the C&O did acquire it for the purpose of getting freight train access to the newly opened steel mill out at hell, getting old. I can't remember the name of the place, but about midway between Gary and Michigan City, there's a substantial steel mill that opened there, and the CNO really wanted in, so they just bought the railroad, probably with the intention that they would once they get the railroad, they could get rid of these passenger trains and just have themselves a nice little access there. Well, that didn't work that way. Uh, but part of the process was then in 1970, they trimmed back from downtown South Bend. Take note of the Studebaker here, built right there in South Bend. They trimmed it back to the edge of town where the Amtrak station is now. 1981 was the end of electric freight operations, the Little Joes, the 700 series locomotives that they had gotten from the New York Central. Uh, and I think the steeple cabs were already gone by then. But the end of electrified freight operations. Um, by 1982, the Insull era cars were in desperately bad shape. Okay, so 1926, 36, 46, 56, 66, 76. These things were already 55 years old. They had had rugged service, especially operating in street running, a lot of road salt. Those cars were just being held together any way they could. So the Northern Indiana Commuter Transit District was formed to provide financing for the new cars, which they got in 1982. They've gotten subsequent orders. And then, thanks to the good folks in the Burlington in 1949, they got uh, gallery style bilevel cars in 2009. In 1992, they extended service to the South Bend Airport by using a freight spur that it used to come into town, um, somewhat parallel to the green line that you see there. In 1992, they already had a freight spur that went up and served a bunch of industries along here. They just upgraded that and then hooked around into the airport, and that's the way it goes to the airport now. This is the strategic plan, and it's more than a strategic plan. This is in the midst of being implemented. They are now building more than just the proposed uh, realignment coming into the west side of the airport. That's phase number one. But phase number two is that they are in the strategic plan are intending to reestablish service to downtown South Bend. There is a community of interest with the people in South Bend. I think they're intending to use the old New York Central Company Union Station that's also the bus station down there. So that is stuff that is somewhat in the future. Just this past year, they they did the project to eliminate the street running in South Bend that used to just stop in front of the 1920s era station, and now They basically just ran this thing right through on the same right of way. They actually had to buy all the houses on one side of the street, but it's not completely grade separated yeah, not grade separated, but it's out of the street. But these pictures are taken in the same location. So kind of summarizing what's going on is a lot of stuff on the South Shore. The the airport realignment, the Michigan City project, they're double tracking all the middle part. Um, they'll do a rebuild of or maybe a new Gary station, and then the first expansion of the interurban, so to speak. Remember, the Monon wanted to buy it. Well, the Monon, since went out of business, so you got taken over by CSX. This trackage was no longer needed. It was torn up, and it became a rails to trails project. And this is notably a trails to rails project that, according to what the original plan was, to land bank many of these routes. So this is in construction, and I guess we're about 2 years away from its being open. This requires a new Hammond station, but the South Shore Line is not the country interurban anymore. So, a little bit about what happened to the commuter trains. All of the companies were losing money. Even the CNNW was actually breaking even operationally, depending on um, how you uh, kept the books. But it was getting to be a desperate situation in the early 70s. The Regional Transportation Authority was formed to provide operating subsidies initially to the existing carriers. Things went from bad to worse. The Rock Island completely went out of business, so RTA found themselves in the railroad business. Uh, After several years of funding turmoil, it got restructured so that the rail part of the RTA subsidy became Metra, and the Metra actually became the operator of the various suburban services in various configurations. The bus services then were the Pace suburban bus service was established as part of this RTA restructuring. RTA then, or Metra, has then gone about and doing some expansion. In 2006, they established the Metra North Central service on what is now the Canadian National, was at the time that this service was established, was the Wisconsin Central. Before that, it was the Sioux Line, and in the 1890s, it was the Wisconsin Central, who already had operated a substantial suburban service up along this corridor. So this is actually reestablishing service that got discontinued in the 1890s. Another extension was going straight west on what was originally the Galena and Chicago Union, became the CNW for over a century, and then is now the Union Pacific. Uh, West from Geneva, where the service had ended since the 1800s, out to Elburn. Uh, it kind of looks like Westchester in 1925 or Nile Center, but with the expectation that this will all be homes and businesses and stuff. This was taken on opening day, and I have not been out there, but I suspect there are already buildings. In 2006, they extended the service on the former Wabash and N&W from Orland Park out to Manhattan. No, not the Manhattan, but our Manhattan. Our Manhattan is a little smaller than your Manhattan. So that brings us to what the Metro system looks like today. The former CNW, the former Milwaukee Road, the former Wisconsin Central, and all those other companies. Uh, CNW, Milwaukee Road, CNW, CB&Q, then Burlington Northern, then BNSF, Chicago and Alton, and then the GM&O, and then the ICG, and now Canadian National. The Wabash, N&W, the Rock Island, um, and the Illinois Central. So, late breaking news, just about 45 days ago, Metra placed an order for these battery powered trains to be run on that little Rock Island branch that looks like a streetcar as a kind of a pilot project, which might be finally uh, bringing a sunset on the Burlington 1949 gallery car concept that's now 75 years, a 75-year-old car design. So, we're going to just visit the CTA very quickly and then museums, and we'll get this wrapped up. I'm going to do a fast survey of CTA rapid transit equipment as we have known it in our era, whoever we are. The 4000 series cars from the 1920s, the 1940s experimental cars that finally found a home. These were the 5000s until they got renumbered 51 through 54, I think they was. The 6000 series cars that were delivered in the 1950s. The 1 through 50 cars, they were fun little cars that operated on the Evanston shuttle as effectively as streetcars. They had fare boxes. And you would go there were no ticket agents or so you would just get on the car and in the front, and the motorman had a little beveled window on the cab with a fare box, and you just went in and dropped your fare in the fare box, and you went down and then sat down just like you were on a streetcar. So the 1 to 50 series cars were from the very late 1950s, early 60s. Then in 1964, the 2000s came along to replace most of the 4000s. In 1969, the Bud cars came to open Dan Ryan, the new Dan Ryan service, and then in 1970 the Kennedy service. In 1977, the 2600 series cars came on the scene that were taking the place. The 4000s were already gone, but to expand the rail car fleet. Then in the early 80s, in 1981-ish, 1982, the 30, I think they were 2800 series cars running into the low 3000s. Those are the only cars, the oldest cars that are still running on the system. This is in Oak Park, the Sioux Line, in the trench that was opened as part of the expressway project this part in 1960. Then in 1992, these cars arrived for the purpose of replacing the last of the 6000 series cars. These were the 3200s, if I remember right. Then in the early 2000s, the 5000 series cars came on the scene. They replaced the last of the 1977 cars. And now just being delivered are the 7000 series cars that are just coming onto the property at this time. So that's all the cars that have been on the system now since the last wood cars were retired in 1957. So the last two things about the CTA, the big project is that part along that they took over from the from the Tacoma, Milwaukee, and St. Paul. They did that concrete embankment, if I remember right, about World War I era. And the trouble was with that they had steel reinforcing bars that gradually the current return from Renegade current return started using those to get the current back to wherever it was supposed to go. And it basically, the electrolysis started to destroy the reinforcing bars, and it was not to any huge safety degree yet, was destabilizing that concrete embankment. So the decision got made, let's blow away the entire concrete embankment, and it's being replaced now with an overhead structure, but not metal like the old ones were. This was part of that red purple modernization. One of the things that was done was to create a flyover where the northbound Ravenswood trains could leap over and go west on Ravenswood without blocking southbound um, red line trains or purple line Evanston Express trains. And the last thing that's going on with the CTA at this moment then is um, the intended extension of the Dan Ryan line that was opened in 1969 down to 130th Street. Um, I think it's someplace between getting the funding and getting the final design done, if I remember correctly. So we'll close this out with a summary of some of the museum operations, the Illinois Railway Museum being um, the major one, uh, with a quite a substantial setup. This is kind of old because the food service hasn't been, it's now back in service, but they're actually creating a little main street that I think they're actually going to run streetcars with real street running eventually, just for a very short distance. But substantial museum. A second museum is the Fox River Museum out on former Aurora, Elgin, and Fox River Electric interurban trackage. This is a former Aurora, Elgin, Fox River Electric car that has come back it had been on the Brookins property in Cleveland before uh, that fleet got scattered. So they got one of these cars that can operate on not only the original right of way, but undoubtedly the original rails. The AENFR ended electric operation in 1935, but a little spur from the Illinois Central up to the Elgin State Hospital continued in operation until the 1960s or even 70s. And the Fox River Trolley Museum then operates on the remnant of that track, which was original Aurora Elgin Fox River Electric. The third one in the region that's significant is East Troy, up in southern Wisconsin. It's got a substantial little museum operation on former Milwaukee Electric trackage. And I'd just like to point out that this woman with the blue coat here, that's my wife. So then right here in the city is the Chicago History Museum has got Chicago and South Side elevated railroad car number 1 displayed there, as well as the Pioneer, the original locomotive of the Galena and Chicago Union that started the service in 1968. And with that, we are going to say we've come full circle for 185 years of Chicago transit. And I want to thank you for your attention during this longer, at least for me, uh, program. But I'm hopeful that it has given you a real sense of when you come to Chicago, what do I see and why is it the way it is? So once again, thank you so much. And